quickly. Hamza is our, in his own words, expert. He covers books of Hazrat Masih Maud Islam and other Jamaat books. So it's always nice every week to go over a new book. So Hamza, we told the people what we were covering this week early enough for them to read it and to catch up. So let us know a bit about the book that we're supposed to read this week.
Assalamu alaikum, boys.
Wa alaikum salam.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So, as Murabbi Saab already mentioned, the book we're looking at today is Star of the Empress, and it was written by the Promised Messiah alayhi salam in 1899 on the 20th of August. He presented it in a similar context to the views from his previous book, which was A Gift for the Queen, and it was written for Queen Victoria's Jubilee anniversary. In the book, he gives thanks to the British government, firstly, for granting peace and security and freedom in terms of religious freedom for its subjects. He then clarifies issues such as the coming of the Messiah and the Mahdi and the false concepts surrounding this Mahdi as well. And he reiterates constantly that this Messiah, he won't be a violent or forceful person in his means and his methods for spreading the message of Islam. He then also gives further clarity on the concept of jihad and why the concept of atonement in Christianity is also false. So essentially the aim of the book, in a very respectful and short manner, is to first thank the Queen and then give her the message of the true Islam in an appropriate manner. So just to give a bit more context for the Promised Messiah alayhi salam, one of the allegations that obviously has been mentioned today by Zaid Saab as well, one of the allegations on Ahmadis have against Promised Messiah alayhi salam was that he was working for the British government. And they sometimes criticize him for being so thankful and grateful to the government for their rule over India at the time. And this book helps to explain why we are actually so appreciative to them. So there was an Indian rebellion in 1857 where the Mughal emperor, so this was predominantly Sikhs at that time, they were forced to relinquish their power. And then the British government decided to transfer the British India from the East India Trading Company, which is like a company that works based on money, to transfer that power from them to the crown. And Queen Victoria at that time, she condemned all the violence and the atrocities from both sides, from the British officers and of the rebels as well, as many villages were laid to waste and many innocent people lost their lives as well, including the well-known city of Delhi at that time as well. She then transferred that power from the company to the state with an emphasis on generosity, love, and the key thing, which Promised Islam always reiterates, is religious freedom and tolerance. Prior to the transfer of that power to the crown, the Mughal emperor and the Sikhs of the time would inflict a lot of abuse and persecution on those of other religious backgrounds, including Muslims. And again, the Prophet ﷺ, his father and his grandfather, they will also suffer a lot of hardship due to this rule, which I'll get onto in a later slide as well. So then he begins the book by praying that Allah Almighty bless Her Majesty the Queen in every single sort of way. He then reintroduces himself as the Prophet ﷺ, as Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian, and he mentions that most of the inhabitants are very appreciative of the Queen and her rule. And this comes from the comfort, again, that they're enjoying in the sense of fairness and love for all of her subjects, regardless of religion or ethnicity or anything else. He then mentions the book he wrote previously for Queen Victoria, A Gift for the Queen. He was hoping to get a response from her of some sort, but unfortunately he didn't receive one, which again was why he's written this book, to refresh that concept, that idea from the previous book. He then goes into more detail on his own background. So as mentioned at the start, the Prophet ﷺ was from a noble Mughal family of the area of Punjab. And as mentioned earlier, prior to the Sikh reign, his ancestors were rulers of their own independent state before the Sikhs took over. He then mentions his great grandfather, Mirza Ghul Muhammad, who was, he mentions in the book, was a very wise and brave person with a lot of noble characteristics. And he was actually considered for the throne to Delhi at one point. But due to the coming reign of the Sikhs and other powers at hand, this proposal didn't actually get approved. And then many atrocities were committed against Muslims, to the point where by the time the rebellion had happened, there were only actually 5 villages remaining that were predominantly Muslim in that area of India and in Qadian as well. And then his father, Mirza Ghulam Murtada, who was also a great well-wisher of the British government, he was also willing to actually provide aid to the British in the rebellion. And that after his death, the Prophet ﷺ then detached himself completely from worldly matters, as we know, and then he became very occupied with tabligh and preaching the true word of God Almighty and Islam. And then, as mentioned before, he mentions many prayers for the Queen, and this is just one of them. For example, there's quite a few in the book, but this is one. O God, keep this august Empress of India, may her sovereignty endure, safe, and may she reign long over us. And let the shade of your succour protect her at every step, and prolong the days of her prosperity. And then he goes on to his claim as the promised Messiah, Islam, and he explains how both Muslims and Christians believe in the advent of a Messiah and a Mahdi. There's also a prophecy regarding the peaceful reign of the Queen, that this peaceful reign is also an indication of the advent of the promised Messiah, Islam. And he compares his coming to that of John the Baptist in the form of the second coming, spiritually, of Elijah. And in the same manner, he's also the second coming of Hazrat Isa, alayhi salam. Then he also describes that when a sovereign or a ruler is well-intentioned and they genuinely care for their subjects, then a spiritual person is always sent to the earth according to the strength and desire of the ruler who wants the best for their people. And he compares this reign of Queen Victoria to that of Caesar of the time of Hazrat Isa alayhi salam. And Caesar, obviously, it's a name that we're not all we know the name, but we don't know that much about that person. He was also, in the time of Hazrat Isa alayhi salam, he was a very good person, and he was completely against cruelty. And that Caesar also wanted the welfare and the freedom of his people. So he makes this comparison with the Caesar of Jesus alayhi salam's time with that of the Queen Victoria's goodness as well. And her goodness, her intent, and her genuine sympathy for her people is like that of Caesar. Hence why the Prophet ﷺ was raised among her people in her time. He then goes on to mention how the Messiah ﷺ to come will serve as a judge and a distinguisher between truth and falsehood. One of the names given to the Prophet ﷺ is Al-Hakam. This is also one of the attributes of Allah the Almighty, and it means an arbiter or a wise judge. He then talks about the word Nazareth, as in Jesus of Nazareth, and it means spiritual freshness or vigor. I think I pronounced that right. He links this to his village, which was originally called Islampur Qadi Maji, and the Qadi aspect of his name, that means judge. So then this can then be linked to the Prophet ﷺ being the final arbiter or judge of God. And then with this village, when it became a self-governed state, it became known as we know it as Qadian. And again, the main point from this comparison is that both Nazareth and Qadi are spiritually important names. So Nazareth means spiritual vigor or spiritual health / freshness. And the word Qadi means spiritual judgment or arbitration, which again was the task of the promised Messiah alayhi salam. He then goes on to talk about the current state of Muslims who have somehow concluded that jihad means to murder innocent people and to forcefully propagate the faith. Alhamdulillah, the work of the Prophet ﷺ has somewhat clarified these misconceptions, but he relates to the Queen that there are still some who believe this to be the right way of spreading Islam. He then refers to the Quran, which clearly condemns such actions, and that religion should be spread through the pious model and through the character and the actions of its followers, and not through force. And then he reiterates to the Queen that Islam was never ever spread by force at the time of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. The sword was only ever used in self-defense and to establish peace. He then condemns the idea that the Messiah will be such a person who will force people to accept Islam, as such a person is meant to have the essence and character of Hazrat Isa alayhi salam in every respect. And looking at the life of Hazrat Isa alayhi salam, we know that such violence and force can't be attributed or associated to this Israelite prophet. And then after the Muslims, he talks about the current state of Christians who unfortunately have attributed the word curse to the Messiah alayhi salam, who, funnily enough, in the same gospel, he's also called the light. So then he explains the concept of lan or lanath, which comes in both Hebrew and Arabic actually, and it signifies that the heart of the person is rebellious and completely separate from God, and such a person is essentially wholly impure to the point where they also become he describes it as subservient to Satan. And then he questions the heart of Hazrat Isa alayhi salam. He questions, did Hazrat Isa alayhi salam's heart become like this? Did he become an enemy of God? And obviously the answer is no. So this is a very grave mistake on the part of the Christians. And then he draws reference to all of his arguments and reasoning for Jesus alayhi salam, that he did not die on the cross and that he was an innocent person. And he mentions the statement from the gospel that his condition will be similar to that of Prophet Yunus alayhi salam or Jonah alayhi salam. Hence he emerged from the tomb alive, and in like manner Jonah alayhi salam emerged from the belly of the fish or the whale alive. He also draws the Queen's attention to Kashmir, where the tomb of Hazrat Isa alayhi salam has been located, and all of the evidence surrounding his journey from Palestine to Kashmir. And he again draws reference to the details of Jesus alayhi salam in his book, Jesus in India. And then finally, he finishes the book again, thanking the Queen for her laws, which draw people of all nations together in peace and unity and harmony. He briefly mentions again that that to die on the cross is an accursed death, and this can't be associated with Hazrat Isa alayhi salam. And he refers her to the prayer that Hazrat Isa alayhi salam recited at the Garden of Gethsemane, where he's supplicating to God that why he's forsaken him to die an accursed death, and that in this desperation, his prayers were heard and accepted by God Almighty. And he again thanks the Queen for her peaceful role, which is allowed for all the tabligh of the Promised Islam on many issues, and that spread across the country and eventually throughout the whole world. And then he just finishes with the prayer on our screens now. O Lord, keep our Empress of India forever happy in all respects, and may it be so that a higher power from you draws her to your everlasting light and enters her into an eternal and everlasting tranquility, for nothing is beyond you. Everyone say Ameen. Jazakallah.
Jazakallah. Hamza, 17 pages.
That was it.
You can see that we just literally covered the whole book, but every
Mm.
week all the pages are different. Sometimes it's 80, sometimes it's 50, but the amount is the same. And you could probably have talked about this much, much longer. And especially the prayers of Hazrat Masimo to the Queen. I think that's a very beautiful thing and something for us to learn from. In fact, just as Rashid, you were talking about your prime minister in Canada, you know, how amazing they rule their countries. In the same way as Massimo knew that and he saw that and he saw how the Queen is a good person at heart. And so we should always remember that we should always, especially in these times, not go against our government in the ways that people are going. So Jazakallah, Hamza, again, was very beautiful and very beautifully put, and the way you managed that. We're looking forward to the next book. Before you decide, let us know so that we can also read up on it as well.
Yeah, inshallah, I'll let you know soon.